The air was unusually crisp that morning, the kind of sharp chill that makes your lungs sit up and notice. I was walking Max, my golden retriever and certified service dog, along our familiar HOA trail. His harness clicked softly as he trotted beside me, ears perked, tail wagging in that gentle, rhythmic way that always made me feel safe, even in the world's messiest neighborhoods. I'd barely taken a step past the first bend when I heard it, a shrill, commanding voice slicing through the quiet. You can't let your dog, here." I froze, squinting. There she was, Mrs. Margot Hensley, the HOA president with a perfectly pressed white blouse, glaring like she had personally been appointed by fate to enforce the universe's unwritten rules. She was brandishing a canister in her hand. I didn't think much at first. It looked like one of those industrial-strength air fresheners, but before I could react, a fine spray hit Max's face. He yelped, recoiling, his fur dampened and smelling sharply of something chemical. My stomach dropped. "Ma'am, stop!" I shouted, fumbling to grab him. He stumbled back against my leg, shaking, his usual calm demeanor replaced by confusion and fear. "He's a service dog. You can't—" "Oh, please. He's just a dog, not a child, and I'm keeping our neighborhood pristine," she snapped, waving the canister like a weapon. I blinked, unsure if I was angry, terrified, or just dumbfounded. The neighbors, emerging cautiously from their windows, formed a hesitant semicircle, phones in hand. Some whispered, some gasped, all silent witnesses to the absurdity. Max whimpered again, pressing against me. I felt a surge of protective fury. "This is illegal," I said, voice shaking but deliberate. "Service animals are federally protected. You can't—" Margot froze for a split second, the sudden pause almost comedic until she regained her rigid posture. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly. Then, without missing a beat, she tried to flare indignation like armor. I knelt down, brushing Max's damp fur with trembling hands, watching her eyes dart from me to the small crowd, finally landing on her perfect little HOA clipboard like a lifeline. That's when it hit me. This was going to escalate, and fast. I swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. The thought I couldn't shake, one that made my stomach twist, was that no one really knew just how far she might go next. And then, almost as if on cue, I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens wailing in the distance. The sirens grew louder, a sharp contrast to the quiet tension of our little cul-de-sac. My hands were still trembling from brushing Max off, but the distant wail felt like a lifeline. Proof that someone might finally take this seriously. Margot, on the other hand, stiffened like a porcelain doll about to shatter. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and I swear I could see the gears turning behind those frosty blue eyes. I didn't do anything wrong," she said, her voice trembling in that very particular way people use when they're caught but desperately want to look untouchable. "Spraying a service dog is illegal," I said again, keeping my tone measured despite the adrenaline, "and people are calling the police." Her eyes flicked toward the crowd of neighbors, most of whom were filming on their phones, half in awe, half in disbelief. Margot's composure cracked. "I'm enforcing the rules," she spat. "This neighborhood can't just let people, dogs, run amok." Max nudged my leg, leaning into me, eyes wide and wary. I felt a wave of guilt for ever thinking we could just walk peacefully here. He didn't deserve this, and neither did I, yet suddenly the entire world seemed to be shrinking into the center of Margot's righteous fury. Then the crunch of tires on gravel, the first police car, made everyone freeze. Margot's face went pale, the very color of her designer scarf. She straightened, clasped her clipboard like a shield, and tried to muster that same self-righteous authority she always wielded. Two officers stepped out, badges glinting in the sunlight. "We got a call about an assault," one said, voice calm but firm. Margot opened her mouth, clearly rehearsing something indignant, but the words faltered. She looked at the officers, then at Max, then back at me, and suddenly her voice caught. I didn't know. I knelt beside Max, stroking his fur, trying to steady him as his nose twitched nervously. "You didn't know?" I asked softly, not angry, just incredulous. "It's a federal crime to harm a service animal. That's literally the law." The officers exchanged a look. One of them crouched to Max's level, checking him over. "He's okay physically," he said, but his tone implied that the situation was far from resolved. Margot's shoulders sagged. For the first time, I saw her unsure. No clipped lines about rules or authority, just frozen panic. It was almost satisfying, in a small, guilty way. And yet, I knew better than to think it was over. Because when a Karen has a reputation, when the HOA powers are involved, when federal law has been invoked, this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. The officer looked at Margot again, very deliberately. "Ma'am, do you understand this is a federal offense?" And that was the moment her bravado completely crumbled. Margot's face turned the exact shade of regret you see in bad TV courtroom dramas, an awkward mix of red and white, like someone had hit pause on her life and left her mid-scream. She opened her mouth, then shut it, then opened it again. The words that came out were weak, trembling. I didn't mean—" The officers were patient but firm. "Ma'am," one said, "spraying a service dog is a federal crime. That's not something we can negotiate. You need to come with us while we file a report." Her shoulders slumped as if the air itself had betrayed her. Her perfect, polished aura, the same one that had her neighbors running to report the tiniest HOA infraction, was now crumpled into something pitiful. I could almost hear her thoughts. How did it get this far? I was just trying to enforce the rules. Max leaned against me, still jittery but alert. His ears flicked at every word, every movement like he understood more than anyone gave him credit for. I stroked his fur, whispering, "It's okay, buddy. They can't hurt you now." The crowd of neighbors had grown. Phones were out, capturing the slow-motion collapse of Margot's authority. Someone muttered, "I can't believe she actually got herself arrested." Another whispered, "She sprayed his dog. Who even does that?" The shock in their voices was real. Some of them had tiptoed around her for years, nodding politely to avoid conflict, never imagining this level of absurdity. Margot's freeze turned to frantic fumbling. She tugged at her scarf, adjusted her clipboard, tried to form sentences that could somehow excuse the inexcusable. The officers remained calm, gently guiding her toward their vehicle. Her eyes darted to Max, pleading silently. But there was no saving grace here. Federal law doesn't care about HOA authority. I exhaled slowly, finally feeling a fraction of relief. The adrenaline that had kept me taut for the last 15 minutes began to ebb, replaced by an exhaustion so deep it made my knees ache. Max nudged my hand, looking up at me with that unwavering loyalty, and for the first time in this nightmare morning, I let myself smile. But relief was short-lived. One officer handed me his card, his tone softening. "We'll need a statement from you, and expect follow-ups. Federal charges are serious." I nodded, already imagining the paperwork, the phone calls, the possible court dates. This was not over, not by a long shot. Margot might be frozen now, but her network, her HOA cronies, the whispers behind closed doors, they wouldn't stay quiet. I looked down at Max. His fur was damp, his eyes wide but trusting. "We've survived today," I whispered, "but somehow I have a feeling the drama is just getting started." And as I watched Margot being escorted into the squad car, the last thing she did was turn and glare at me. Not just me, but the entire street, as if daring the world to remember her downfall. I had a sinking feeling. She wasn't done, and neither was the HOA war she was about to unleash. By the time I got home, Max had curled into his favorite spot on the rug, his damp fur beginning to dry in the sun that spilled through the living room window. I poured a cup of coffee, hoping the warm liquid would do more than just wake me up. It needed to calm my rattled nerves. The adrenaline from earlier hadn't fully subsided, and my hands still twitched whenever I thought about Margot, her spray can, her frozen stare. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Green, one of the Neighbor Watch regulars, the ones who usually whispered gossip behind hedges rather than confront anyone directly. "Margot's calling an emergency HOA meeting. Tonight. Be ready." I frowned, setting the coffee down. Of course she was. Of course she wasn't done. Even with federal charges looming, the woman's obsession with control hadn't dulled an inch. She wasn't just an HOA president, she was a strategist, a master of passive aggression dressed as civic duty. I glanced at Max. He looked up, head tilted, eyes questioning. I gave him a reassuring pat. "Looks like we're going to have front row seats to a spectacle," I muttered. He wagged his tail slightly as if to say, "I hope there's popcorn." Later that evening, I walked into the HOA clubhouse. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle. Margot, surprisingly, wasn't there yet. Instead, I was greeted by a murmur of neighbors, some curious, some visibly nervous. The air was thick with tension, like everyone was anticipating a battle, but no one knew the weapons. Finally, Margot arrived, clipboard clutched like a life preserver. She swept into the room with her usual air of authority, though her earlier freeze lingered as an undercurrent, making her steps slightly hesitant. "Everyone," she began, voice high and slightly wavering, "we need to discuss standards in the community." A few neighbors exchanged glances. One man, bold as ever, raised an eyebrow. "You mean spraying service dogs and calling the cops?" The room went silent. Margot's eyes flared, then narrowed, and for a fleeting second I caught that old, untouchable glare. But the longer she stood there, the more I realized she was floundering. She had no plan, no script for this scenario. Her empire of HOA perfection was cracking under the weight of one little federal law. As the meeting spiraled into pointed questions and awkward accusations, I leaned back in my chair, trying to stay calm. But even as Margot sputtered and tried to reclaim control, I could feel it. She was plotting, scheming, and the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood committee anymore, it was a battlefield. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. Margot's freeze today was temporary. Tomorrow, or maybe even tonight, she'd strike again. And next time, it might not just be words. The night after the HOA meeting, I couldn't sleep. Max rested at the foot of the bed, ears twitching at every faint noise outside, while I replayed Margot's faltering words over and over. She had lost her composure in front of everyone. Yes. But humiliation often breeds obsession, and I knew that obsession would find its way back to me. By mid-morning, my fears started proving true. The HOA bulletin board, usually a dull parade of reminders about lawn heights and parking rules, had suddenly turned into a battlefield. Margot's official notices were scattered across the board. Cryptic rules about pet conduct, citations for imaginary infractions, and thinly veiled warnings directed at me. All residents are expected to comply with community standards immediately. The words practically screamed, "I'm coming for you." I sighed, brushing Max's fur. He nudged me with his nose as if saying, "Don't panic, we'll handle it." I wanted to believe him, but the reality was undeniable. This wasn't just about a service dog anymore. This was about control, humiliation, and one woman's ego. Later that day, I found myself face to face with Margot at the mailbox. She leaned against the post, clipboard in hand, smiling a thin, practiced smile. "I hope we can resolve these little misunderstandings," she said, tone saccharine. I leveled my gaze. "I hope you remember, ma'am, that service animals are federally protected. Any further harassment could escalate your legal troubles." Her smile faltered, but only slightly. "We all want a harmonious neighborhood, don't we?" she said, eyes flicking to Max. "Harmony. And rules." I nodded slowly, deliberately, letting the words hang in the air like a warning bell. "Rules are one thing. Assaulting a service dog is another." She froze, a flicker of panic crossing her features before she masked it again with forced civility. As she walked away, I could almost hear the gears turning, calculating the next move. For the next week, subtle signs of her campaign appeared everywhere. Neighborly whispers, anonymous reminders left on my doorstep, and even a complaint to the city about supposed noise from Max, who, by the way, hadn't barked more than twice in the past month. It was the quiet, insidious kind of harassment designed to unnerve you without leaving evidence. And yet, through it all, Max remained calm, loyal, steady. I realized then that our bond wasn't just emotional. It was a shield. As long as I stayed alert and careful, we could withstand whatever schemes Margot tried next. But as I stared out the window that evening, watching her car idle across the street, I felt the first pang of dread. She wasn't done. This wasn't a battle over a spray can anymore. This was war, and I had a very bad feeling the next move was coming sooner than I expected. The tension had been building all week, each morning feeling like tiptoeing through a minefield. Max and I had developed a routine. Stay alert, avoid unnecessary confrontation, document everything. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be enough. Margot was relentless, and after the spray incident she seemed untouchable in her own mind, even with federal law looming over her head. It was Saturday when it happened. I was walking Max along the edge of the neighborhood park when I saw her. Margot, standing by the entrance like a hawk, arms crossed, clipboard in hand, her posture screaming defiance. She wasn't alone. This time, a small posse of HOA loyalists hovered near her, whispering, watching. "Good morning, Margot," I called out, trying to keep my tone casual. Max sat by my side, calm but alert. She gave me a tight-lipped smile, one of those smiles that tries to hide both fear and fury simultaneously. "Morning," she said, voice clipped. "You really should keep Max on a shorter leash." I raised an eyebrow. "I'd rather follow the law than your rules, ma'am." Her eyes flicked to Max, and for a brief second I saw hesitation, maybe even fear. But it vanished quickly, replaced by that cold, calculating glare that had caused so much chaos already. Before I could react, one of her HOA cronies stepped forward, and suddenly I realized they weren't here for casual intimidation. They were trying to provoke me, hoping I'd lose my temper. But I stayed calm, letting Max sit obediently beside me, his harness a clear signal that this was no ordinary pet. Then came the sound I had been both dreading and anticipating. Police sirens. A second unit, this one federal, pulled into the park. Officers stepped out briskly, badges glinting, eyes locked on Margot. "Ma'am," one of them said, voice firm, "we've received reports of harassment and assault involving a service animal. You need to come with us." Margot froze completely this time. Her lips parted, but no words came. She glanced at her followers as if expecting them to rescue her. They didn't move. She was utterly alone. I knelt beside Max, stroking his fur. He looked up at me, calm, steady, like he had known all along we'd make it through. And in that moment, I realized, all the fear, all the tension, every small act of intimidation, it had led to this. She had finally met the limits of her control. As the officers guided Margot toward the car, the whispers and stares of neighbors followed her. Some shook their heads, others smiled in quiet relief. But Max and I stayed rooted where we were, silent and victorious, not in triumph, but in the quiet justice of survival. The sun dipped low, painting the cul-de-sac in gold, and for the first time in days, I felt it. A fragile, hard-earned peace. Margot's reign of terror had ended, not with yelling, not with confrontation, but with the law stepping in and protecting what mattered most. Max nudged my hand, tail wagging faintly. I smiled down at him, whispering, "We did it, buddy. We survived the HOA apocalypse." And as we walked home together, I knew one thing for certain. Never underestimate a service dog, or the person who loves them. If you felt the tension in this story, hit like, because supporting everyday justice begins with your click. Subscribe to Karen Files to catch every story of ordinary people standing their ground. And leave a comment. How would you have handled facing a Karen like this?